Paul Ward stared at the legal document in his weathered hands, the words blurring together like everything else had since Martha died. The lawyer, Fletcher Knox, had just delivered news that made no sense. He'd inherited a cave from a great uncle he'd never met, a man named Ezra Ward who died under suspicious circumstances in the Canyonlands south. "I don't understand," Paul said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "A cave? What am I supposed to do with a cave?" Fletcher shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your uncle's will was specific. He left you the cave and nothing else. No money, no property, just coordinates to a location in the Canyonlands." He paused, studying Paul's hollow expression. Local authorities said it appeared worthless when they investigated his death. Nothing but rock and darkness, according to their report. Paul's dog, Rusty, a red-coated shepherd who'd barely left his side since Martha's funeral, suddenly lifted his head from where he'd been resting by the fireplace. His ears perked forward, and he began sniffing at the legal papers with unusual interest. The dog's behavior had been restless lately, pacing at night, refusing his favorite treats, as if something was troubling him. "There's something else," Fletcher continued, pulling out a yellowed envelope. "Your uncle left this note, said to give it to you only after you received the inheritance." Paul tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. "Trust Martha's letters. She knew the truth about everything." The words made Paul's chest tighten. Martha's letters? What letters? His wife had never mentioned knowing any Uncle Ezra, had never spoken of family beyond their immediate circle. How could a stranger refer to correspondence Paul had never seen? Rusty suddenly stood and walked to the door, scratching at the wood with an urgency that seemed tied to the mention of Martha's name. The dog turned back to him, golden eyes alert, and Paul noticed the animal was fixated on the envelope still in his hands. "Where are these coordinates exactly?" Paul asked, though he wasn't sure why. Fletcher consulted his papers. "About a day's ride south of here near Devil's Canyon. But Paul, I have to warn you, there's been talk. Your neighbor Darius Gentry visited my office twice asking about any inheritance you might receive. He seemed unusually interested in your uncle's affairs." Fletcher lowered his voice. "And given how your uncle died, that rockfall seemed awfully convenient. I'd be careful who you trust with this information. You think Uncle Ezra's death wasn't an accident? I think men with secrets often meet unfortunate ends in remote places." Rusty's scratching at the door grew more insistent, and something in the dog's behavior made Paul's pulse quicken. The mention of Martha's letters had clearly agitated the animal, as if the dog remembered something Paul had forgotten. As Fletcher gathered his papers to leave, Paul caught sight of the man's nervous glance toward the window. "Fletcher, what aren't you telling me about my uncle's death? Just be careful down there, Paul. And if you find anything unusual, anything at all, you might want to contact the federal marshal's office before you contact anyone locally." Fletcher paused at the door. "Your uncle may have been involved in things bigger than a simple cave inheritance." The lawyer's words hung in the air like a warning. And Paul realized that whatever Uncle Ezra had left him, it was far more dangerous than a worthless hole in the ground. 3 days later, Paul found himself riding south toward Devil's Canyon, his saddlebags packed with enough supplies for a week. The decision to make the journey had come suddenly, sparked by both a visit from Darius Gentry and his growing obsession with Uncle Ezra's cryptic note about Martha's letters. Darius had arrived at sunrise, his polished boots clicking against the wooden porch as Paul sat drinking coffee that had grown cold in his hands. "Heard you came into some inheritance," Darius said without greeting, his eyes scanning the rundown ranch that Paul had let deteriorate since Martha's death. "Nothing that concerns you," Paul replied, though something in Darius's tone made his stomach tighten. "I'm always interested in opportunities, Ward. Been expanding my holdings, looking for properties with potential." Darius stepped closer, his shadow falling across Paul's worn boots. "Inheritance can be a burden, especially for a man in your circumstances. I'm prepared to make you an offer. Cash, today. Whatever your uncle left you, I'll pay fair market value." Paul had looked up then, meeting Darius's calculating gaze. "You seem mighty eager to buy something sight unseen. Business is about taking calculated risks. Remote properties can be more trouble than they're worth. Transportation costs, security concerns, legal complications." Darius spoke smoothly, but something in his eagerness felt forced, rehearsed. Now, as Paul's horse picked its way along the rocky trail, those words echoed in his mind. Darius's visit had been unsettling. But what truly drove Paul south was Uncle Ezra's note about Martha's letters. What letters? In 6 months of grief, he'd gone through every drawer, every box, every corner of their house. If Martha had written letters to Uncle Ezra, where were they? Rusty trotted alongside the horse, the dog's behavior more focused than Paul had seen since Martha's death. Every few miles, Rusty would stop and sniff the air, as if tracking a familiar scent, then press forward with renewed energy. The dog had always been sensitive to Martha's moods and routines. Perhaps he was remembering something about her writing habits that Paul had missed. "You know something I don't, boy," Paul murmured, watching as Rusty's ears perked forward at the mention of Martha's name. The dog turned back to look at him with those intelligent golden eyes, then deliberately faced south again, as if understanding their destination. The landscape began to change as they traveled deeper into the canyon lands. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient monuments, and the air grew thinner, carrying scents of sage and desert flowers. Martha had always wanted to explore this region, had talked about riding out here together someday to see the formations she'd read about in her books. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and Paul had to grip the saddle horn to steady himself. 6 months since the fever took her, and the pain still struck without warning, leaving him breathless and hollow. But as they crested a hill overlooking a vast canyon system, Rusty suddenly bolted ahead, barking with an excitement Paul hadn't heard since before Martha's illness. The dog disappeared over the ridge, his barks echoing off the canyon walls with what sounded almost like recognition. Paul spurred his horse forward, but when he reached the spot where Rusty had vanished, what he saw below made him question whether grief had finally driven him to madness. The dog was sitting perfectly still beside a narrow opening in the canyon wall, his tail wagging slowly as he stared up at Paul. It was as if Rusty had been here before, as if this place held memories that Paul didn't share. But how could that be possible when neither of them had ever traveled this far from home? Paul dismounted and made his way down the steep slope, loose rocks sliding beneath his boots. The cave opening was larger than it had appeared from above, wide enough for a man to walk through upright, though darkness swallowed the interior after just a few feet. Rusty remained motionless beside the entrance, his tail rigid, every muscle in his body alert. When Paul approached, the dog looked up at him with an intensity that seemed almost human, then deliberately stepped into the cave and disappeared into the shadows. "Rusty," Paul called, his voice echoing off unseen walls. He'd brought a lantern, and now he lit it with trembling hands, the flame casting dancing shadows on rough stone walls. The cave stretched deeper than he'd expected, the passage narrowing and widening unpredictably. Strange marks scored the walls, not natural formations, but deliberate cuts in the rock, as if someone had carved symbols or directions. Paul traced one with his finger, feeling the smooth edges that spoke of careful work, not random scratches. 20 feet inside, he found Rusty sitting beside a pile of rocks that didn't belong. These weren't canyon stone, but river rocks, smooth and rounded, clearly transported from somewhere else. They'd been arranged in a deliberate pattern, forming a rough circle around a flat stone that bore more of the carved marks. Paul knelt beside the arrangement, his lantern revealing something that made his breath catch. Carved into the flat stone was a name, Martha Ward. His hands shook as he traced the letters. It was impossible. Martha had never been here, had never even left their county. She'd been born and raised within 50 miles of their ranch, had lived her entire life in familiar territory. Yet here was her name, carved in stone, in a cave he'd inherited from an uncle he'd never met. "This doesn't make sense," he whispered to Rusty, who whined softly and pawed at the stone. Paul lifted the flat stone and beneath it found a small metal box, its surface green with age but still intact. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded ribbon. The top letter bore Martha's distinctive handwriting, addressed to Uncle Ezra. Paul's world tilted. Martha had written letters to Uncle Ezra, the uncle who'd left him this cave, the uncle he'd never known existed. His hands shook as he opened the first letter, dated just 2 years ago. "Dear Uncle Ezra," it began, "Paul still doesn't know about you, and I think it's better that way. He's been through enough loss in his life, but I need to tell someone about the doctor's visit, about what's coming. The fever's spreading faster than they expected." Paul sank to his knees on the cave floor, the letter crumpling in his grip. Martha had known she was dying, had known for months before she told him, and somehow, she'd been in contact with his uncle, a man Paul had never heard of until 3 days ago. Rusty suddenly growled, a low rumble that echoed off the cave walls. The dog's attention was fixed on the deeper darkness ahead, where Paul's lantern light couldn't reach. From somewhere in that darkness came the sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving toward them through the cavern. Someone else was in the cave, and they were no longer alone. Paul grabbed Rusty's collar and pulled the dog behind the rock formation, extinguishing his lantern with a quick breath. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the scrape of boots against stone. A faint glow appeared from the depths of the cave, growing brighter as whoever was approaching drew nearer. "I know you're in there, Ward," a familiar voice called out. Darius Gentry emerged from the darkness, carrying a lantern of his own. "Saw your horse up top. Figured you'd come sniffing around eventually." Paul stepped out from behind the rocks, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "Following me now, Darius? That's low, even for you." "Following?" Darius laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Boy, I've been coming to this cave for 20 years. Your uncle and I had an arrangement." He held up his lantern, illuminating the carved symbols on the walls. "Ezra was supposed to sell me this place when he died. Instead, he left it to some nephew he'd never met." "You knew my uncle? Knew him?" Darius set his lantern down and pulled out a folded paper. "I was his business partner. This cave isn't worthless, Ward. It's worth more than your entire ranch, more than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. He waved the paper in the air. "This is a survey report from 5 years ago. Your uncle found the largest silver deposit in the territory right here under your feet." Paul felt the world shift beneath him. Silver. That explained Darius's eagerness, his immediate offer to buy the inheritance. "If you were partners, why didn't he leave it to you?" "Because your wife poisoned him against me." Darius's expression darkened. "Martha wrote him letters, filled his head with stories about my business practices, made him think I was cheating him." He gestured toward the metal box Paul still held. "I'm guessing you found some of those letters." Paul clutched the box tighter. "Martha never mentioned knowing Uncle Ezra." "Course she didn't. She was protecting you from the truth about your family." Darius stepped closer, his shadow falling across the carved stone. "Your uncle wasn't just a hermit living alone in some distant town. He was a wealthy man, Ward. Wealthy because of what's in this cave. And Martha convinced him to cut me out of my rightful share." Rusty growled low in his throat, positioning himself between Paul and Darius. The dog's hackles were raised, his body tense and ready to spring. "That arrangement you mentioned," Paul said slowly. "What exactly did it involve?" Darius smiled, but it was cold and calculating. "Ezra needed someone with connections to move the silver without drawing attention from claim jumpers and federal surveyors. I provided transportation, security, buyers. In exchange, I got 40% of the profits." He pulled out a gun, keeping it lowered but visible. "I've invested 5 years of my life in this operation, Ward. I'm not walking away empty-handed because some dead woman turned my partner against me. And if I refuse to honor this arrangement, then you'll have an accident. Just like your uncle did." Darius raised the gun slightly. "Ezra got careless. Started talking about changing our deal after reading Martha's letters. Cave-ins happen all the time in these old formations. Tragic, but not uncommon." Paul's blood ran cold. "You killed Uncle Ezra. I protected my investment." Darius gestured deeper into the cave. "Now you're going to show me where he hid the silver he'd already extracted, and then we're going to discuss the terms of our new partnership." But as Darius stepped forward, Rusty suddenly bolted past him into the darker recesses of the cave, barking frantically at something Paul couldn't see, something that made Darius's confident expression disappear entirely. Paul followed Rusty's barks deeper into the cave, Darius close behind with his gun drawn. The passage opened into a large chamber, and Paul's lantern revealed why Darius had looked so shaken. Uncle Ezra's body lay against the far wall, partially covered by rocks that had clearly been placed there deliberately. But more shocking than the corpse was what surrounded it. Dozens of wooden crates stacked against the walls, each one marked with shipping labels addressed to banks in distant cities. "He was supposed to be buried," Darius muttered, his gun wavering slightly. "I paid 2 men to take care of the body after the accident." Paul knelt beside his uncle's remains, his stomach churning. Ezra Ward had been a large man, and the rocks covering his lower body couldn't hide the obvious trauma to his skull. "This wasn't a cave-in. Your uncle got greedy. Started talking about giving everything to family instead of honoring our agreement." Darius kept his gun trained on Paul while scanning the crates nervously. "But these weren't here when I left. Someone moved the silver after Ezra died. Rusty was pawing at one of the crates, whining urgently. Paul pried off the lid with his knife, and inside found not raw silver ore, but refined silver bars, each one stamped with official markings. Dozens of them, worth more money than Paul had ever imagined. This isn't from the cave, Paul realized, studying the stamps. These are from the Federal Mint in Carson City. Darius's face went pale. That's impossible. Ezra was mining silver from this cave for years. Paul opened another crate, then another. All contained mint-stamped silver bars, not raw ore. There's no silver mine here, is there? Uncle Ezra was storing stolen federal silver. No, that's not. Darius lowered his gun slightly, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. I saw the survey reports, the geological samples. There's silver in these walls. Fake reports. Paul held up one of the silver bars, its weight substantial in his hands. Uncle Ezra was running a completely different operation. He was stealing from federal shipments and storing the silver here until he could move it safely. Rusty suddenly barked at the cave entrance. His ears pricked toward sounds Paul couldn't yet hear. Horse hooves on stone, multiple riders approaching fast. Federal marshals, Darius breathed, recognizing the sound. Someone tipped them off. Paul looked down at the metal box still clutched in his other hand, understanding flooding through him. Martha's letters hadn't been about protecting Paul from family secrets. She'd been reporting Uncle Ezra's crimes to federal authorities. The last letter was dated just days before her death, which meant Martha was working with the marshals, Paul said slowly. She turned Uncle Ezra in before she died. Darius raised his gun again, this time pointing it directly at Paul's chest. Then you're coming with me as insurance. We're going out the back passage I used to get in here. But Paul was no longer the grief-stricken man who'd ridden south 3 days ago. Standing in this cave, surrounded by evidence of his uncle's crimes and his wife's courage, something had shifted inside him. Martha hadn't just been protecting him. She'd been protecting the entire territory from men like Ezra and Darius. No, Paul said quietly, setting down the silver bar and standing slowly. I'm staying right here. The sound of boots echoed from the main entrance as the marshals entered the cave, their voices growing louder as they navigated the passage. Darius's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Rusty launched himself at the man's gun arm with a snarl that echoed off the chamber walls. The gun discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as dog and man crashed to the ground. But Paul knew the sound would bring the marshals running, and Darius still had a knife at his belt. The gunshot echoed through the chamber as Rusty and Darius struggled on the ground. The dog's teeth locked around the man's wrist. Darius cursed and reached for his knife with his free hand, but Paul kicked it away before he could grasp it. Federal marshals, identify yourselves. The voice came from the main passage, accompanied by the sound of multiple men moving quickly through the cave. Paul grabbed the fallen lantern and held it high. Paul Ward, I'm the cave's owner. He kept his voice steady despite his racing heart. I've got Darius Gentry restrained here, and there's evidence of federal crimes. 3 marshals entered the chamber, their badges glinting in the lantern light. The lead marshal, a grizzled man with gray hair, surveyed the scene with experienced eyes. The stolen silver bars, Uncle Ezra's remains, and Darius pinned beneath Rusty's weight. Marshal Harrison, the man introduced himself, motioning for his men to secure Darius. We've been tracking this silver for 8 months. He gestured toward the crates. Your wife's letters led us here, Mr. Ward. You knew Martha? She contacted us 6 months ago with information about suspicious silver transactions in this region. Said her husband had a relative involved in federal theft, but that her husband was innocent. Harrison knelt beside one of the open crates, examining the mint stamps. These bars were stolen from a federal transport near Carson City last year. Your uncle was the inside man. He worked for the mint and had access to shipping schedules. Darius spat blood from where Rusty had bitten him. You've got nothing on me. I was just a buyer. Didn't know the silver was stolen. We have your uncle's records, Harrison told Paul, ignoring Darius. He kept detailed logs of every transaction, including payments to Mr. Gentry here for transportation and security. He stood, dusting off his knees. Your wife saved us months of investigation. Paul felt a mixture of pride and grief wash over him. Even while dying, Martha had been working to protect innocent people from men like Darius and Uncle Ezra. She'd known Paul would be devastated to learn about his family's crimes, so she'd handled it herself. What happens now? Paul asked. The silver goes back to federal custody. Mr. Gentry faces charges for receiving stolen goods and accessory to murder. Harrison looked at Uncle Ezra's body. We'll need your statement about what happened here today." As the marshals secured Darius in shackles, the man shot Paul a venomous look. "This isn't over, Ward. I've got friends who won't appreciate losing this operation. Then they can join you in federal prison," Harrison replied curtly. Paul knelt beside Rusty, who was panting heavily from the fight but otherwise unharmed. The dog's loyalty had saved his life, just as Martha's courage had saved countless others from becoming victims of the silver theft ring. But as they prepared to leave the cave, Harrison pulled Paul aside. "There's something else, Mr. Ward. The stolen silver is worth over $200,000. Federal law provides for a recovery reward. 10% of the value goes to the person who helps recover stolen goods." Paul stared at the marshal. $20,000. More money than he'd see in a lifetime of ranching. "Your wife's information made this recovery possible," Harrison continued. "The reward is rightfully yours." But as Paul looked around the chamber where his uncle had stored his stolen fortune, where Darius had murdered a man for greed, he realized the money felt tainted by blood and betrayal. The real treasure wasn't the silver bars or the reward money. It was understanding what Martha had died protecting. 2 hours later, Paul sat outside the cave as the marshals finished cataloging evidence and preparing Uncle Ezra's remains for transport. The sun was setting over the canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold that Martha would have loved. Rusty lay beside him, the dog's fur still dusty from the fight, but his breathing steady. Paul scratched behind the animal's ears, thinking about how the dog had somehow known to react to Martha's name in Fletcher's office. Dogs had good memories. Rusty must have seen Martha writing letters at the kitchen table, had associated her activities with something important. "Mr. Ward," Marshal Harrison approached, carrying a leather satchel. "We found this hidden behind one of the silver crates. Your uncle's personal effects." Paul opened the satchel and found more letters, these written in Uncle Ezra's handwriting. The first one was dated just days before his death, addressed to Paul, but never sent. "Nephew," it began, "if you're reading this, then Darius Gentry has probably made good on his threats. I've been a fool, thinking I could steal from the federal government without consequences. Your wife Martha contacted me months ago, offering me a chance to make things right before it was too late." Paul's hands shook as he continued reading. "Martha told me about her illness, said she was worried about what would happen to you after she died. She convinced me to cooperate with the federal marshals in exchange for your protection. The cave was supposed to be my gift to you, not the stolen silver but the reward money for turning it in." Marshal Harrison sat down beside Paul. "Your uncle was planning to surrender himself and testify against Gentry's operation. We had a meeting scheduled for the day after he died, but Darius killed him first. Gentry suspected something when your uncle started asking questions about getting out of the business. We think he followed Ezra to the cave and confronted him." Paul read the final paragraph of his uncle's letter. "I know you'll never forgive what I've done, but Martha believed you deserved a chance at a better life. The reward money could save your ranch, give you the fresh start she wanted for you. Don't let my crimes taint her gift." The irony wasn't lost on Paul. Uncle Ezra had planned to give him the same $20,000 reward that Paul was now entitled to receive. Martha had orchestrated the entire situation, even convincing a criminal to turn himself in to protect her husband's future. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, pulling out an official document. "When we arrest someone involved in a federal crime ring, we investigate all their known associates. Gentry's been buying up land around here using money from the silver operation." Paul looked up from the letter. "What does that mean?" "It means all his recent land purchases were made with stolen federal property. Those transactions are void." Harrison handed Paul the document. "Including his attempts to buy your neighbor's properties. The land around your ranch is going back to its original owners, and Gentry's assets are being seized." Paul realized what this meant. Darius wouldn't be returning to threaten him or his neighbors. The man's entire operation was crumbling, his ill-gotten empire dissolving under federal investigation. As the marshals loaded the last of the silver bars onto their pack horses, Paul made his decision about the reward money. Martha had died protecting people she'd never met from a criminal operation. The money would honor her memory properly, but first he needed to get home and read every letter she'd written to Uncle Ezra, to understand the full scope of what his wife had sacrificed to keep him safe. Paul arrived home just as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. His ranch looked different now, not like the decaying symbol of his grief, but like something that could be restored, rebuilt into what Martha had always envisioned it could become. Inside the house, he lit every lamp and spread Uncle Ezra's satchel contents across the kitchen table, where Martha used to write her letters. There were dozens of them, spanning nearly a year of correspondence between his dying wife and his criminal uncle. The earliest letter was dated 13 months ago, just after Martha's first visit to the doctor. Her handwriting was still strong then, her words clear and determined. "Dear Uncle Ezra," it began, "I know this letter will surprise you, since Paul has never mentioned having family beyond what I've been able to research. I'm writing because I'm dying, and I need to ensure my husband's future is secure." Paul's throat tightened as he read her methodical approach to protecting him. She'd spent weeks tracking down Uncle Ezra's location, weeks more convincing him to correspond with her. In her letters, she'd slowly drawn out the truth about his silver operation, his partnership with Darius, and the danger that would eventually reach Paul's doorstep. "Your nephew is a good man," one letter read, "but he's trusting to a fault. Men like Darius Gentry will see him as an easy target. If you truly care about family, you'll find a way to protect him from the consequences of your choices." Martha had been strategic, playing on Uncle Ezra's guilt while offering him redemption. She'd researched federal reward laws, contacted Marshal Harrison herself, and planned every detail of exposing the silver theft ring, all while fighting a fever that was slowly consuming her strength. One letter, dated just 2 months before her death, revealed the depth of her sacrifice. "The doctor says I have weeks, not months. I've told Paul the fever is responding to treatment because I need him focused on living, not on losing me, but I'm running out of time to ensure his safety. You must agree to cooperate with the marshals, Ezra. Promise me you'll protect Paul from Darius after I'm gone." Paul wiped tears from his eyes as Rusty settled beside his chair. The dog seemed to sense the emotional weight of the moment, placing his head across Paul's boots in quiet companionship. The final letter Martha had written was dated just days before her death. "Paul doesn't know I'm writing this, but I need to tell someone how proud I am of the man he's become. He sits by my bedside every night, reading to me, telling me stories about the ranch we'll rebuild together. He still believes I'm going to recover because that's the kind of hope that makes him who he is." Paul's hands shook as he read her last words. "I've arranged everything so that my death will lead to his protection and prosperity. The cave inheritance will bring federal attention to Darius's crimes. The reward money will save the ranch. But most importantly, this ordeal will show Paul that he's stronger than he knows." She'd orchestrated his entire journey, the inheritance, the confrontation with Darius, even the discovery of her letters. Martha had turned her death into his salvation, ensuring that her final act would be one of love rather than loss. Paul looked around the kitchen where she'd written these letters in secret, fighting her illness while planning his future. The house suddenly felt less empty, not because she'd returned, but because he finally understood that she'd never really left. Her love was woven into every detail of what had happened in that cave, every moment of danger she'd anticipated and planned for. Now, he had to decide how to honor that love with the gift she'd given him. 6 months later, Paul stood in the yard of his restored ranch, watching as the final wagon load of supplies arrived. The $20,000 reward had transformed more than just his property. It had funded something Martha would have been proud of. The Martha Ward Memorial School was nearly complete, built on the eastern section of his land where she'd always dreamed of starting a place for local children to learn. The federal reward money had covered construction costs, teacher salaries for the first 2 years, and supplies for dozens of students whose families couldn't afford proper education. Marshal Harrison visited that morning, bringing news that Darius Gentry had been convicted on federal charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. His entire criminal network had been dismantled, and the recovered silver had been returned to federal custody. "Your wife saved more than just your ranch," Harrison told Paul as they watched children playing in the school's new courtyard. "That silver theft ring was planning to expand operations across 3 territories. Her information stopped them before they could recruit dozens more men like your uncle." Paul nodded, understanding now why Martha had been so determined to expose Uncle Ezra's crimes despite her weakening condition. She hadn't just been protecting Paul. She'd been protecting every honest person who might have become a victim of Darius's expanding criminal enterprise. The schoolhouse bell rang, calling the children inside for afternoon lessons. Paul had hired Mrs. Catherine Webb, a teacher from the nearest town, who'd arrived last month with enthusiasm for Martha's educational vision. The children loved her, and more importantly, they were learning skills that would help them build better lives than their parents had managed. Rusty bounded across the yard, his coat gleaming with health and energy. The dog had become something of a mascot for the school, patient with the children and protective of the property. Paul often wondered if Martha would have laughed to see her old companion teaching youngsters responsibility by letting them help with his care. As evening approached, Paul walked to the small cemetery behind the house where Martha's grave overlooked the school. He'd commissioned a proper headstone with an inscription that captured who she'd truly been: Martha Ward, teacher, protector, and guardian of hope. "The school opens officially next week," he told her, settling on the bench he'd built beside her grave. 23 students enrolled so far, with more families inquiring every week. "You'd be proud of what we built here." The "we" wasn't metaphorical. Every decision Paul had made about the school had been guided by letters Martha had left him, detailed plans she'd written during her illness outlining how to create the kind of educational opportunity she'd always wanted for their community. Paul pulled out the latest letter he'd discovered, one hidden in her jewelry box that he'd only found last week. It was addressed to Paul, for the day the school opens. "My dearest husband," it read, "if you're reading this, then you've found your way through the darkness I knew my death would bring. The school represents everything I couldn't say while I was dying. That love doesn't end with death. It transforms into legacy." Paul felt tears on his cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. They were tears of gratitude for a woman who'd loved him enough to plan for his happiness, even after she was gone. "I've arranged one final surprise," the letter continued. "Check the deed to the school property. You'll find it's been established as a permanent trust, funded by investments I made with money I saved over the years. The school will continue operating long after we're both gone." Paul understood then that Martha's protection extended far beyond his lifetime. She'd created something that would honor their love for generations, a place where children would learn and grow because a dying woman had refused to let grief be her legacy. As the sun set over the canyon lands where his journey had begun, Paul Ward was no longer a man devastated by loss. He was a man fulfilled by purpose, surrounded by the laughter of children and the memory of a love that had conquered even death itself. Rusty settled beside him on the bench, and together they watched the lights come on in the schoolhouse windows, where tomorrow's lessons were already being prepared. Martha's final gift hadn't been the cave or the silver, or even the reward money. Her gift had been showing Paul that the strongest response to grief was to create something beautiful in the world. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.